My name is Frank Kodak, and today, December 8th, 2014, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak not only with a respected law librarian, legal educator, and past president of the American Association of Law Libraries, but also a good friend and mentor. Roger F. Jacobs is Professor Emeritus of Law and Director Emeritus of the Kresge Law Library of Notre Dame Law School. He retired from active service at Notre Dame in 2007. Our conversation is part of the Oral History of Law Librarianship Project, a component of the Spinelli Law Library Reference Shelf on Hein Online. Roger, it is a pleasure for me to chat with you today here at Notre Dame about your life and career as a law librarian.
Pleasure to have you. It's wonderful.
Great. Let's begin by learning a little bit about you personally. Can you tell us about your early life, where you were raised, your family background, and what your childhood was like?
I was born in Detroit in the shadow of the old city airport. My father was a welder, and with the war coming on, he was transferred to Cleveland, and I was about 4 or 5 years old, and I went with him, of course. So I was raised in Cleveland. All my school days were there. My father was, as I said, a welder. My mother was a homemaker. They had a large family. I happened to be the first of 8 children. And while that gave me a privileged place in the family, it also meant you were struggling a lot for the family's time. I had a kind of a parochial school, Catholic school education in both grade school and high school. When I was almost graduating as a senior in high school, my father decided he had enough of Cleveland and he was going to go back to Detroit, where he came from. So I went back to Detroit with the family. And that time, that was about 1954. The economy was not very strong. I graduated from high school, started looking around for work. Wasn't much work in the Eisenhower administration. And my mother started getting on me about being around a lot. So I decided to join the service. I went in the Navy for 4 years. Okay. As a kid, you know, we didn't have a lot, it seems. I worked regularly starting when I was about 15, you know. Kind of a little bit of paperboy money, a little bit of working in a drugstore money went into the family's coffers. Things seemed to be, we didn't have a lot of money, but we never seemed to be struggling.
So the first of 8 children, what was the age range of the children?
Well, my oldest sibling is 3 years younger than I am, and they go down from there. My youngest brother was actually born when I was in the service. He's 17, 18 years younger than I am. My father graduated from the 8th grade. My father finished the 8th grade. My mother went to high school, but she didn't graduate until she was an adult. And she started taking some kind of something like GED courses, I suspect, to finish up a couple grades, and she was thrilled when she got her high school diploma. I was already in high school myself at the time. So there wasn't a history of higher education at all in my family, and that may have, I was a desultory student in high school. Things I liked, I did well in. Things I didn't like, I did less well in. Some not so well at all. And consequently, I think when I got to that time when it was usually going to go back to school, and I wasn't going back to school and I had no job, the Navy seemed to be a promising opportunity for me.
So what were your experiences like in the Navy? This is new to me, I didn't know about that. So were you all over the world, as they say, or?
Oh yes, all over the world. I was sent to Chicago for basic training. I was in a company where they made me the educational petty officer of the company because I think I scored very well on some tests that the Navy gave, and I had a task of trying to bring along some of the people who were a little bit slower. But when I graduated from boot camp, a lot of my colleagues went off to schools of various kinds. They didn't send me to a school. They sent me to a destroyer in Long Beach, California. Long Beach, San Diego, California, I'm sorry. And that ship had just been over off the shores of Korea and took shelling off the shores of Korea just a few months before. I went aboard in December, just before Christmas. And the next year, I sailed on that ship to Japan and China, and we patrolled Quemoy and Matsu. You recall at that, maybe you don't recall, but at that time there was some threats that the Chinese were going to invade Taiwan, and we had to be prepared. So, but it was a boring job. Came aboard the ship, I talked to the executive officer, he said, what would you like to do? I didn't know. He said, well, I need someone in the electronics gang. Would you like to go there? Oh yes, sure, that sounds wonderful to me, learn about electronics. So I didn't know anything. But I took a correspondence course from the Cleveland Institute of Technology, as I recall, and learned a little bit about electronics. But by the time we got back from this cruise, I was pretty bored about this ship. It's only 380 feet long, and there's 180 people that you live awfully close to. And I thought I could learn something. And so I asked if I could transfer to a school, and they sent me to a school, Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay.
Wow.
A year of electronics school. Learned all about electronics. Wonderful. And when I got through with school, I appealed to go back to sea because I was young. I wanted to see the rest of the world that I hadn't seen. Thought maybe I could get to the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. The Navy, in its wisdom, sent me to the Long Beach group of the Pacific Reserve Fleet. 40 out-of-commission destroyers, mothballed ships. Not a single piece of operating electronic equipment. It was sad in a way. I got bored there, and I became, remember Radar on MASH, the company clerk?
Yeah.
Yep. Well, I became the company clerk. I didn't fool around with the electronic stuff. I didn't have a natural inclination for it. And some of the guys in my unit they became television repairmen and radio repairmen, and they were really into this electronic stuff. I got promoted to second-class petty officer and was doing okay, but I became the company clerk, kept the records, maintained these big books with all the destroyers on it, with all the equipment that was in each one, and we would go, mainly the job was to go aboard the destroyers and take out obsolete equipment and throw it away, so that when we went to war, the ship would be ready to take new equipment and be ready to move forward more quickly. Taught myself how to type. Got a typing book, set it there, taught me that. But when it came time to, the enlistment was over, time to I didn't think this was the place for me. I thought I could do better than eating off of tin plates, and so I left the Navy.
So it sounds like that might have been a motivating factor for moving on and saying, geez, I don't want to be bored all the rest of my life. And that what led you to resume education?
That seems like it's too intellectually based. I think I just wanted to do something, and what do you do? I came back. Fortunately, because of the few months I'd been aboard that ship in the Korean service, I was awarded the Korean Service Medal, which involved being qualified for the GI Bill. So I had available money. Saved a little bit, but I had available a way to go to school. So I went home to Detroit. I got home in December. School was going to be, new terms were going to be in January. I went to Wayne State to ask them if I could apply and go to school there. And they said, no, too late. The application period is over. But a very nice lady said, you know, I think the University of Detroit is giving an entrance exam tomorrow. Tomorrow. And if you go take it, maybe they would let you in. I went and took the entrance exam at Detroit. They let me in on probation. My high school record was not very good. Let me on probation. So what was I going to do in college? What would you do in college? What did I know about doing? Well, I liked social studies classes in high school. I liked my social studies teacher. I'll learn about social studies and I'll be a teacher. That's a plan. I found out that first of all, I thought college professors, you know, kind of talked in syllogisms or something. They just were not nobody in my family had ever been to college. Didn't know anybody who went to college. One of the first days I walked in the class, I was walking down that classroom, and it wasn't the first days because it must have been a little bit later in the year. Two faculty members were talking to they were talking about some sporting event that happened the night before. And I didn't, this was really enlightening to me. They talked about ordinary things. I did pretty well the first year. I was on the honor roll. I said, well, I can do this, but I need money. More than the GI Bill is going to pay my tuition and some other thing, but it couldn't support my junker old car that I brought home from California. So I needed some money, and I wanted to go out with girls once in a while, and so got a job. I had experience in high school and working in a library at the elementary school library across the street initially, and then with the Business Information Bureau of the Cleveland Public Library, downtown, where I was a page. So I knew a little bit about libraries. So I went to the University Library and applied for a job as a page. They gave me a job as a page. And then I worked there. They liked what I was doing. I was in the service. I was a little older, more, I guess, amenable to commands or something. And they made me a searcher for missing books, and that was kind of a step up, an extra 5 cents an hour or something like that.
And this is all while you're
I'm going to school.
Going to school, but you're working in the library.
Yeah. And then the librarian wanted someone to work to be kind of the chief clerk in the reserve book room. He was losing a person, and they asked me if I would want to serve as a clerk. I probably at this time was a junior. Sure, I'll do that. So I was working more and studying less, but I worked there about a year. I don't think it could be 40 hours a week. That seems like a little bit too much, but I worked quite a bit every evening, weekends.
Somehow when you're working and a student in the same place, you just kind of go back and forth, and you don't really count the hours.
I remember once or twice coming back from a party, parking in the parking lot, sleeping in my car, and going right into the library to go to work. But then one day, because I'd started in January, I was going to have to go to January to finish the normal 4-year curriculum. But before I got to that point, the university librarian called me in, and he said, how would you like to be my law librarian? He didn't say law. How would you like to go work in the law library? I said, yeah, well, but I have another semester to go beyond this one that I'm in, you know. He said, well, how many hours do you have to do? And I said, well, I have 18 more hours to do. He said, well, let me work on a schedule for you. He was a priest in the order, the Jesuits who ran the school, so he probably went home and talked to one of his buddies at night, and they figured out something. And I graduated a semester early. Graduated in May.
He found you the 18 credits.
He found me the 18 nice credit hours, and got through. And grades weren't great, but they weren't terrible either. So I went to work in the law library the second week after graduation from university. I was then 25, 24 years old. My predecessor in the law library was a microbiologist by training. Right. And she'd worked there a number of years, 2 or 3 or 4. She gave me 2 weeks of introduction to the law library, and then she retired. I was in the law library.
Your first introduction to legal resources and
everything was there. Well, what kind of a staff did you have? The question was. We had, what did you do there? Well, I did everything.
Just to clarify, this is about early 1960s we're talking.
Yes, this was 1962.
1962.
I bought the books. I acquired a classification system. I arranged the books on the shelves. I paid the bills. Did whatever they had to be done. And there was no one else. I was the
You were it.
I was the librarian, I was the cataloger, I was the acquisitions person, I cleaned the tables off and did everything. I didn't know anything. I only remember making one terrible mistake. I threw away a supplement to the New York Digest, not realizing that the supplement I had just purchased was not really a replacement supplement, but it was a supplement to the supplement. Mm-hmm. And that was a mistake. But I was cannon fodder for the...
So while you're doing this, are you beginning to think, well, maybe this has career potential, or is this...
Well, I think the career potential going to this job full-time was, hey, I'm shifting. I worked in the library as a page, as a head of a department, as a clerk, head of a department. Now I'm working in the head of a whole library. Librarianship, this is nice. I like this. I like what I'm doing. This is being around this. This is fun.
You're not bored. It's not electronics.
Yeah. But I gotta be a librarian. So with the help of the director, who spoke for me, highly for me, I was admitted to the Rackham Graduate School at the University of Michigan. I don't think I had the grades for that, but I think he spoke librarian to librarian and got me in. And or they admitted me. So I started going to library school. That was 62. In the summer, I would drive to Ann Arbor, 50 miles, attend classes in the morning, spend a couple hours after classes, after lunch, to do homework and do them, and then go back to the library and work the rest of the day. I mean, the university librarian was subsidizing my education to get me developed and to give me this job, and he wasn't paying me much, like $4,500 a year.
But it was moving you in that professionalization direction.
And I started to learn immediately about librarianship as a profession, more generally, the norms of librarianship. And when I had a problem in the law library that was law library specific, I discovered there was a resource for me. And I would go to the Law Library Journal and I would read everything I could about this problem. And as part of reading the Law Library Journal, I found a lot about other things about law librarianship and about people in law librarianship and that sort of thing. And when I had an opportunity in library school, if I had an opportunity to do some kind of free project of some kind, it tended to be directed, in my view, towards something about law librarianship. And,
so you finished that degree in 1964, I believe. You're still working there at the University of Detroit as the law librarian. I don't know if your staff has expanded at all, but somehow or other you also began attending law classes. Now you've earned
I got the undergraduate degree. I went a summer to library school in Ann Arbor. Then in the fall term and the winter term, the university sent their faculty into their facility in Detroit. So I could continue to take library school classes, but I didn't have to drive to Ann Arbor. So it was summer, a whole winter and fall summer, another summer, another whole fall, winter, and a third summer, and I graduated at the end of the third summer, and that brings us up to 64 or something like that. By that time, I'd worked in the law library for almost 3 full years. And by that time, I'd read a lot of the Law Library Journal. And by that time, it just struck me that there was a place in law librarianship. This was an opportunity in law librarianship that if I had a law degree, it could really be something. In fact, I didn't have any plan. I never had a plan. Except if I got a law degree, certain doors might open to me that would not otherwise open. So as soon as, and by then you're working in law school, you start to feel all these people going to law school, you know what they're doing. They're not so smart like the faculty. there was a dean at the University of Detroit, a Jesuit priest, who came probably, by the time I had I was going to law school then, but he came and I had the library, and he invited me to come to faculty meetings. You imagine this? He invited me to come to faculty meetings, and he treated me as if I was a professional in the law school. The law school didn't have many professionals those days. Most law schools didn't, but certainly this one didn't. So I was the one, there was the faculty, and then there was staff, and I was the one other person who had some advanced degree now. So, and I go to faculty meetings, and I'm kind of trembling a little bit. These are the same guys who were teaching me. But I found out all I had to do was read a little bit, and I could pin their ears to the wall because they weren't involved in legal education or education generally. They were lawyers who happened to be teaching classes.
Sure, right.
Even those who've been teaching a long time were just...
So they were teachers, but they really weren't legal education professionals.
That's right. You would have been hard-pressed to find the list of their scholarship. It's good men. Learned a lot from them, but they...
So you earned that, you eventually completed the law degree in 1970.
Good year, 1970. Got the law degree, dedicated a new law school building at the University of Windsor, passed the bar exam.
Yeah. That's a good definition of good. You could go on the dictionary. A good year, this is what that means.
By that time, I had 2 children and a wife and a mortgage and all those things as well.
Excellent, excellent. Well, okay, so that's good. You've had a great segue. You've moved us from Detroit across the river to Windsor. Not very far geographically.
One mile, about 2 miles from the law school that I was working in to the law school I was going to work in.
But a whole different country.
Yeah.
And a brand new law school.
That was kind of, you sometimes think back, some things you think, I did some things which were audacious in a way. Maybe I didn't know any better. But in the Detroit area, there's a diocesan newspaper that the Catholic Church sponsors. And I happened to read in this diocesan newspaper that the University of Windsor was thinking of opening a law school. Why? I don't really recall why that would have appeared in it. Maybe because the University of Windsor had roots in the Assumption College, which was a Catholic liberal arts college across the river, and maybe that was the connection. But I saw that and I said, well, gee, I'm here. I don't have to face the task of moving. Could just commute there. I wrote the president of the university a letter. Dear Dr. Letter, I read this, I'd be interested in talking to you about that. And he wrote back. I haven't appointed a dean yet, but when I appoint one, I'll let him know that you're interested. And he appointed a dean, and that dean got my letter and heard that I was interested and called me. And I went and talked to him, and it sounded like I would be able to continue to go to law school. I hadn't graduated from law school yet. I could continue to go to law school.
So this is in about 1968,
yeah.
67, 68, yeah.
67, as a matter of fact.
Okay.
Go to law school and take on this job building something. That sounded exciting. I didn't know anything about Canada much, except somebody who, like most Americans know about Canada, there's a lot of snow and they play hockey. But I decided I would be interested, and they made me a salary offer, which was quite a bit more than I was making, and I would be a faculty member, assistant professor's appointment.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you were the first faculty member they hired.
That's right. The dean Dean had an assistant, he hired me, I hired my assistant, and that was for a year or so, that was what we had. But I think it's important to note in my career that from between the time I left Detroit and the time I went into the office at Windsor, I went to New York City for a month. Julius Mark had advertised a program for librarians, kind of up and coming, I guess you call librarians, in New York at NYU for a month-long program. And I took advantage of that. My wife and children were with me. I rented a subleased an apartment, the 27th floor of a 30-story apartment building that was owned by the university, and walked to work. But at that, the more important thing was, at that meeting, I really got a taste of librarianship in the grand manner. The faculty,
Illustrious faculty.
you know, who's who in law librarianship. Probably every one of them in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Law
Oh,
librarianship.
yeah.
And then, and my classmates, I mean, where did I first learn about Roy Mirsky? Every time there was a break, he had to get up and go to take a telephone call. Before a cell phone. But he had to go take a telephone call, and I think he used Julius's phone. But Mortimer Schwartz, Dan Hinke. Others.
Earl Borgeson.
Earl Borgeson was an instructor.
That's what
He was
I
an
was
instructor.
instructor.
Earl Borgeson was an instructor. Art
Marion
Charpentier was a
Gallagher.
Marion Gallagher. All instructors. And were hosted by people like Cohen at his Oceana and Fred Rothman at his place in Hackensack. This is an anecdote. It was at a cocktail party at Fred Rothman's backyard that Earl Borgeson came up with Al Coco and approached me about serving as the program chairman for the meeting that he was going to be president in Houston. Were you at Houston then?
Yes.
Talking about Pat Keogh.
Yeah.
Pat Keogh, yes,
Yeah.
was at Houston.
Yeah. And I said, sure, why not? I mean, it's okay. It was he asked me, and I went, gee, I must have said some things at the meeting or
Did
talked.
you have a prior?
I had no knowledge of him.
You didn't?
I mean, and I had never met him before. But I think maybe it was because he was a teacher at the program, and people
Sure.
talk and ask
Right.
questions,
Absolutely.
and people, you get an impression of some people. In class, you get impressions of your students. Some are smarter than others, and some are.
Well, I do know, having spoken with Earl on a number of occasions about that, about his presidency and about that annual meeting in particular, and then explicitly about who he asked to do. I mean, both you and Al, I think he wanted to go outside. He wanted young, aggressive, outside the box sort of people, and he just thought that was one of the best things he ever did.
Well, it may have worked all right, but I was procrastinating. I was working. I went back to Windsor. Got involved. Geez, how do you do this? Make this. Got involved in that, and I kept putting off the kind of things that a program chairman would be doing, putting out feelers, contacting people, evaluating what it is we needed to talk about, what's the themes of the program, and I kept putting that off. But I got involved at Windsor, really involved, and the dean was Mark McGuigan, young, just a couple years older, a few years older, 6 degrees. Jess J.D. from Columbia, PhD in philosophy from Toronto, everything. But one of the things I recalled was that it's true. It was true at Windsor, and it was true again at Southern Illinois. Is I was the senior faculty member in terms of service, other than the dean. And all the people that came to the law school as faculty members, they came to my school. They came to my organization. They came to what we were building. And that provided the librarian with a unique cachet, I think, and me in particular with a unique cachet. You know, I was on every hiring committee. You know, every one of those guys. You know, they had kind of had a sense of who they were and what they did.
Sure.
You know. So that was marvelous.
That's one of the great things I would assume to be at the ground floor is that you have some opportunities.
Yeah.
I don't know,
I was
control is the right word, but
Yeah.
really have a say in how that plays out and to hire the kind of people that are going to be like-minded and so forth.
And to row a strong oar when decisions had to be made about this or that as it affected the library and affected relationship. And in addition to bringing the faculty to Windsor, we were involved in building this law school. And here's where the difference between Windsor and SIU. I went to Windsor in '67 and we dedicated the law school building in 1970.
Mm. Yeah.
I went to SIU in 1973 and I left there 5 years later, and
Still didn't have a building.
we had talk about a building, and that became tiresome. Because I was so used to the dynamism and the movement and getting it going, and here was fits in Southern Illinois was fits and starts, but Southern Illinois we moved so quickly, and then the problem was I had the problems of building a collection in a Canadian law school. Well, that's where the Canadians were tremendously generous in terms of taking me in, talking to me, discussing with me what they believed are the differences between Canadian legal education and American legal education. What were the primary things that I'd have to be concerned about? What they knew about collections in their places and how a collection building would play out for Windsor. And at the time I moved there, York University was expanding the law school development that had begun at Osgood Hall and had a library at Osgood Hall, which was downtown, kind of a bar thing. They were going to go to the university at York, and they had a number of people on their staff who were really superior librarians. One was Balfour Halevi, the director.
Yeah. Real legend.
Legend in librarianship, a curmudgeon, but a brilliant guy and a bookman that I can only aspire to be. And Diana Priestley, who was probably Miss Canadian Law Librarianship, along with Mary Ann Scott, was probably the big two. And they were very helpful, and I would go up, they would invite me up to their meetings, and they'd be having York University discussions about collection development, about classification systems, about personnel and organization of the library and relationships to the university. And I just kind of absorbed all
So in a way, I mean, you started out with your education in librarianship at Michigan in the library school, and you continued with the legendary institute, NYU Institute.
Yeah.
And then continued on that sort of one-on-one personal basis, which seems to me a lot of folks would say that's where I learned most about librarianship, from those relationships. Yeah. So you've said some nice things about how supportive these Canadian librarians were, but obviously you made an impression on them. You were elected president of the Canadian Association of Law Libraries, and
It's a small country.
well, nevertheless, you were elected.
Well, you know,
and today you still stand as the only person to have served as president of both Canadian and American Associations of Law Libraries.
It was a chapter. I joined. It was a chapter. You wouldn't make. There's a lot of people who are been chapter presidents, who have been presidents of AALL. You know, that's really what I was. I was a chapter president that happened to be there when those folks wanted to declare their independence.
I was going to say you were the person on the ground when they moved from chapter status to the National Law Library Association.
In 1776, I would have been hung as a traitor. I would have been hung as a traitor, but it was a cordial. I think the Americans understood that Canada was a nation in its own right and had interest in having its own National Law Library Association. Law libraries were very important, as we all know, to the government structure, to the legal structure, to the parliamentary structure. The library was important, and they felt that and I think they were right. I thought they were right, and I had no hesitation in composing the letter. It was a pretty good letter, too.
It was. I read that letter. It definitely was. It made the case without any question. And I think you're right. I think it ultimately was clearly the correct thing to do.
But then, you know, I was there, and I started getting feelers from other places to consider. Part of it, I think, was after the Houston meeting. My you know,
Star has risen.
Then a little bit of recognition. People started coming, and I was at Windsor probably 1972. I had taken the opportunity to visit Rutgers Camden, and they offered me a wonderful position, a lot of money, and gave me the opportunity. I hadn't finished law school yet, but of course Penn wouldn't consider me, but Temple would have. In fact, they agreed to take me in and let me transfer my credits back to Detroit so I could get my degree at Detroit. But I decided that I would stay at Windsor. We still had some things to do there. So. But then, a year or so later, I had this school in Texas was interested in placing somebody, and they called me down. Salmon was the director of the University Library. And at the same time, this guy, Hiram Lazar, was taking up this job, and he was interested in talking about it. And I came back telling my wife after visiting Carbondale that Carbondale reminded me of a place that looked like it fell off the back of a hay wagon. And I was sure I had a lock on the Houston job. But I didn't know about Hiram. Well.
And Hiram had been the dean at Washington University in St. Louis for 15 years, a legend in his own right as a legal educator.
In some senses, though, I didn't like the history that he had at Washington U in terms of the library didn't look like a library that had developed like I would have liked to have seen it develop. But that being the case, there was this young woman evidently at Houston who had some creds, and she beat me out for the job. What can I say?
Are we talking about Lolly Gasaway?
Lolly Gasaway. She came back to haunt me because she beat me out for another job a couple decades later.
It's hard to beat, let's face it.
So
it's not just you.
Yeah. So she, but Hiram prevailed. I think I had come to the recognition that while I liked Canada a lot and had a lot to offer, I wasn't going to move to Canada, and I wasn't going to become a Canadian. It's interesting, all the time I worked in Canada, I read the Detroit Free Press as a matter of love. The first thing I did on the way into the office, I picked up the Globe and Mail, the national newspaper of Canada, to read what was going on in Canada because I thought that was important to the job.
Right.
But I didn't read it because I really wanted to read it. I read it because it was kind of an
need to know.
Need to know. Yeah. So I went to Carbondale.
So you started a brand new school at Windsor, and now you've come to start a brand new school in Carbondale, Southern Illinois University School of Law, which is way down at the bottom part of the state, not anywhere close to Chicago, not anywhere close to any kind of big city, as you know.
Well, it was a real change. It was a real challenge for my family because not only am I the oldest of 8 who all lived in the Detroit area, but my wife is the oldest of 9.
Oh.
And she was the firstborn in her family. And she was because her mother was kind of constantly having children, she was a surrogate mother for the younger siblings that she had.
Yeah.
So it was a really close attachment to that. And that moving away from them was a really hard choice. And we back and forth, back. You know, we flipped a coin.
Did you really?
Carbondale won. So we should do 2 out of 3. Carbondale won. So.
Well, once again, you're the first faculty member hired for a law school, SIU, and although you didn't get a building built, you got a library built. You got.
We had so many buildings. I don't even remember where all the offices were. I remember the Blue Barracks is where we really started legal education at SIU. Was a steel structure right alongside the railroad tracks.
Still there, but not used for classrooms.
Yeah.
Thank goodness.
And then we were moved, as we grew, we moved out to an area what they called it small group housing. Is it still there?
It is still there.
But the law school is still right around the corner from the small group housing. But there we occupied 2 or 3 buildings, I recall.
Yeah, there are contiguous buildings, right?
The library was chopped up, and legal education was chopped up there, but we were planning for a new building. We were planning, trying to put into place the mistakes I made at Windsor, and trying to work with the architects to pay attention to what was going on in architecture and legal education, and that was exciting. And by then I had a little more background and a little more experience, and had been more involved in AALL stuff, and my name was even more out, and I think I was known as someone who would consider opportunities, and I had opportunities. At one point, I don't know, I've been at SIU 4 years. I was contacted by Cornell and Virginia simultaneously. I interviewed them almost simultaneously. I got offers from them almost simultaneously. And I couldn't decide what to do. Cornell bothered me because the librarian boss was the director of libraries. Everything I knew about law librarianship, that was an evil. And I didn't like that idea. Otherwise, it was beautiful. A beautiful campus, beautiful place, great library, wonderful people in the background. And Virginia was a great school, but it was big. It had 1,000 students. It had 60 faculty members. It was in the South. And Charlottesville struck me as a town that was unlike any that I'd ever seen before in terms of roots. Go back a long way in that town, and I didn't know how comfortable that would be. Start hearing about, well, you want to live in this neighborhood because this is where the good schools are. You want, and that. But frankly, I would have been succeeding a long-time librarian and Miss Farmer.
Frances Farmer.
Yeah. And I don't know, this is maybe one of the things you're talking about in terms. I went to give a faculty, you have to give a faculty presentation there, and I was prepared with a formal presentation, and then I went in, and there were 6 faculty members. That wasn't, the formal presentation went out the window, and I talked, and Frances came in. And I was talking about service, library service. This is what and she got up and left. I thought that I was saying something that really either offended her or was she just thought I was dumb.
I always kind of view that as kind of the dividing line, that generational dividing line. I think the librarians, from her sort of going backwards, that just wasn't an issue, and yet moving forward, that's not a concept that is a surprise to anybody at that point and beyond. I mean, that's just
Yeah.
That's what we're here for. We're not here necessarily, obviously we need to build the collection to have the resources to provide the service, but that's the reason we're building the collection. It's not so we can be this grand repository and protect, and yet I think in the older version of librarianship that was what it was mainly about.
Well, I went back to Southern Illinois and I had these offers and I went to talk. Hiram was not a guy who shared a lot of things with me. He never, he wasn't a guy, except at time, just the time came out and I said, this is my problem. I got these offers and he says, Roger, if you want to go, if you think those are good things, he says, but if money makes a difference, he says, I have never lost a faculty member to another institution because of money. And he says, I will meet any offer that you get from another institution. I went home and told him I wanted to stay here. The building was we were still building, we were still planning the building, we still that hadn't been done yet.
Right.
So there was plenty to do there.
Mm-hmm.
And I enjoyed my time, I enjoyed it. So.
Well, and I would imagine that if you gave a presentation at SIU, whatever the size of the faculty was, they'd all be there. Now, it might not be much larger than 6, at least initially, but they'd all be there.
Well, it was a interesting time too. With those young students coming back, many of them were not so young, but they were coming back from Vietnam. Ad terrorem tactics do not work very well for someone who's flown into the Valley of Death. I mean, it's just when I played poker many nights with students and other faculty members, it was just different.
Well, it's interesting you should bring that up because I've spoken with many of the people that were in those initial classes, and you're talking about the problems, the challenges of teaching, and where you've got multiple buildings or buildings that are, ought not to even be there at that time, let alone decades later. And yet they speak with tremendous fondness and pride and a camaraderie and a collegiality about their classmates and about their faculty members. That and maybe playing poker had something to do with that, but it's sort of like, hey, we're in this common enterprise together. We're sort of going to war together, a little bit.
Well, that's I think you raised a question somewhere else, but the first time I think I just reminded me now is faculty dinner, at the end of the year, and they were giving away prizes, and the students awarded me a prize. Early on in the faculty member of the year prize, and I was overwhelmed by that collegiality or that relationship. And, still remember that.
Yeah. Well, I know you've spoken. We've obviously with my relationship at SIU, and probably the greatest thing that happened to me in my career was going to a school where you had begun the library, and then Liz Kelly continued your work and completed that building that you had been planning. So I'm very familiar with that, but you've spoken over the years of how fond you were of that experience. But nevertheless, fondness or otherwise, in 1978 you did finally make a decision, and you went to a whole different kind of institution as librarian of the United States Supreme Court Library.
My wife was in the Carbondale Hospital delivering our third child, or getting ready to deliver our third child, and I got this letter, very simple, stationery, Supreme Court of the United States. Opened it up, big gold eagle in the middle of the stationery, and I went to show it to her. I said, the Supreme Court of the United States wants me to come and talk to them about it. Asked me if I'm interested in the job. I think I should be interested in the job. And, so I went. Immediately, any other time I'd gone to other places to interview for a job, there was somebody that, Hiram met me at the plane, you know, and when I flew in. And other people would have a car and they would take you to the hotel and they would show you, yeah, show up at the court at 10 o'clock at this time. Nobody told me how to where to go exactly. You know where the court is. Yeah, I know that. I go there and I walk up this. I'm kind of nervous, but I walk up the steps, you know, toward the Grand Hall. I get to the top. The doors are shut. Big bronze door. And I look around, and there's a beer can top open. I'm in America. Yeah. The door, the entrance door during the day or hours was another place in the building, so I found it and got in. But, the long and short of it is they liked what they saw, and I think they had shopped around a bit, and they had been turned down by others. And here was a guy who was youngish. By theirs, someone said one of the only reasons you got this job was because, notwithstanding your age, you had gray hair. And you know, I was 40, but I had a full head of gray hair at the time. I don't know if it made a difference, but I got the job.
Well, it's interesting you should say that some had turned down that job, because my sense is that when you, at that time, while in name, that sounded like, you know, how could there be a better opportunity in the country? In reality, maybe that library wasn't what it should have been, and it seems to me like your, if you look at your career and the places you've gone, they've all been places that were either starting from scratch or basically needed to start over. There were building projects, and correct me if I don't have it right, but it seems like that was...
I think you're right. I think you're right on. People went there and they saw what the situation was, and they didn't think that they wanted to deal with that. And I went there and saw what the situation was, and then didn't really think about how it was to deal with that. And I didn't think of some of the other parts of the job that I could mention in a minute, but I just saw it as the Supreme Court of the United States. This is the Supreme Court of the United States, and look at this thing, and I have a chance of being the librarian here.